Support for WUWM podcast comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Pewaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape our community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
Last year, Lake Effect reported on MKE Roots, a program from Marquette University that helps Milwaukee-area teachers incorporate local history into their lesson plans. The goal is to make social studies feel more relevant to students by focusing on local history. But earlier this summer, MKE Roots federal grant funding was abruptly cut, along with about 20 programs nationwide. In its place, the Trump administration is now funding civics education that commemorates the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Lake Effect's Sam Woods revisited members of the Milwaukee Roots program to discuss how the program has adapted, what the future holds, and how the Trump administration is redefining education.
Last summer, I was on a school bus with Milwaukee-area teachers during a visit to Milwaukee's lakefront to learn about our city's indigenous history.
We won't be getting back on the bus until after lunch, guys.
It was part of a program called MKE Roots, and I spoke with teachers about how they would incorporate what they learned into their curriculum.
My students are mainly Latino. They are from the south side of Milwaukee.
One of those was Sepia Grace Buchanan, a 7th and 8th grade teacher at MPS's Longfellow School. Last year, Buchanan gushed about all she had learned and how she would adapt her social studies curriculum. Because in the past, she had students choose a historical figure, often a former president, to do a report on. But this year, she had students choose local figures to learn about from both the past and the present.
Jr., Dr. Sergio Gonzalez, Father Grappi, Solomon Juneau, Bishop Cedric Daniels, the young lady that did him, she did a beautiful job.
Buchanan said she wanted to focus on local history because it's easier for students to see themselves in that context. Instead of trying to connect with a powder-wigged president from Virginia, they could see American history through the eyes of someone who grew up down the street from them.
When you teach them about the dead presidents, like, they're looking at you like, yeah, he's no longer here, and why is that even relevant now? But when they started learning about these MKE figures and started just even the research, they were so interested, like they couldn't wait, like they were working on their paper any minute that they could. The same spark I had last summer is the same spark they had when I introduced it to the class. Like they were just totally geeked about it.
Buchanan also set the project up for students to wrestle with the complexities of historical figures, in part by diving into what the gossip was about them in their time.
But the biggest piece about their paper was the T for that person. So what's the 411? What's the information that the internet's not necessarily just coming right out and telling us? What's making this person interesting to you, or why you chose them, or something that just sparked your interest about them? And so that part made the research even more fun because they had to dig a little deeper. And I said, when they mention someone else's name, research that person and see what what that person's talking about. So that made them dive a little deeper.
Turns out, when you give students a relatable figure and allow them to wrestle with the he said, she said of their time, they end up practicing becoming better residents of our city.
The students always associate being famous or world-renowned with popularity and how many people know you and things like that. And these people weren't even that popular, and it was okay. And they still affected our community, affected our city in great ways. And when they realized that, they learned that even the small things they do matter. When you clean up your neighborhood, that matters. That affects people.
A civics education that goes beyond the surface level and helps middle schoolers practice wrestling with complicated political topics, becoming more civically engaged in the process, that seems like a teacher's dream. You may think that MKE Roots, the program that sparked this shift in Buchanan's curriculum, could tuck this experience away as evidence that their program is working and continue for the foreseeable future. But as a new presidential administration consolidates power, the priorities of American civics education are shifting, catching programs like MKE Roots in the crossfire. As we learned last year, MKE Roots is a project from Marquette University's Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach. It's designed to help Milwaukee-area teachers incorporate local history into their social studies curriculum. The hope is that as Milwaukee-area teachers learn more about local history, the better they get at making history feel more relevant to the students they teach. The program includes various online resources for teachers, as well as a week-long summer institute where teachers visit different historical sites in the Milwaukee area. But as this year's institute was about to get going with a new cohort of Milwaukee area teachers, the program received devastating news. Melissa Gibson, associate professor at Marquette University and faculty director of MKE Roots, explains.
Right before our summer institute began this summer, we received a letter from the Department of Education from someone high up there saying that our grant was discontinued. They used a pretty formulaic letter that it turns out that every discontinued grant got that doesn't really give specific information, but just says that we no longer serve the priorities of the Trump administration. And it gave a list of possible reasons why that could be that included things like harming the students we purport to help. There is not an emphasis on merit and fairness and opportunity, financial mismanagement, and there were one or two others, but none of those things were true or are true about MKE Roots. We held our institute. It was fabulous, another wonderful group. But we since learned after the institute that of the, I believe there are 26 currently funded American history and civics grants. The fiscal year ends September 30th, that of those 26, something like 20 of us have been discontinued.
As Gibson says, MKE Roots was not the only program to get its grant funding cut. Kaylin Belsha, senior education reporter with Chalkbeat, explains what this grant from the Department of Education is meant to fund.
The way that this program has worked over the last few cycles, it kind of depends on the administration. They can add some priorities in there. But generally, what they ask for is kind of a strong program that has a history of training teachers, that might have relationships with local school districts in their area, that have staff who are really familiar with the kind of complexities and nuances of teaching history, which is both content knowledge, like what actually happened in history and making sure kids understand that, but then also building skills, which could be asking critical questions, doing historical research. So there's kind of two branches there.
Once a grant has been awarded to a program like MKE Roots, new presidential administrations typically do not rescind funding without documented cases of mismanagement. But this time around, the reason for rescission was a little different.
In this particular case, the reason that was cited for the Biden-era grantees losing their money had to do with what the Trump administration said was connected with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some of that is tied to the fact that that was in the prior grant application. And so some of the language, they're just kind of objecting to what was actually in the grant application. So it's not unusual for a new president and a new administration to say, these are my priorities, but it is unusual to take away funding from something that was kind of in the middle of their work.
Using a term like diversity, equity, and inclusion to justify action has been a consistent theme in the Trump administration. At his State of the Union address in March, Trump made clear he would be going after anything the phrase appeared on, or that he could apply it to.
We've ended the tyranny of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion policies all across the entire federal government and indeed the private sector and our military. And our country will be woke no longer.
But as Belsha says, some grant programs that had their funding cut were surprised their programming counted as DEI.
A lot of them did not see their work as connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They just happened to be working in communities that served a lot of people of color, or maybe the history of slavery was really important to the work that they were doing, or they were focused on helping students tell their own stories. And so I think people were kind of confused sometimes about why they were singled out. And in some cases, their work wasn't that different than some of the grantees that got to keep their funding. So this was kind of a confusing thing for both me and for others of trying to understand why exactly some folks lost their money and some kept it.
MKE Roots reported that of the schools represented by teachers in their program, 80% of students were students of color and 60% qualified for free or reduced lunch. Shortly after learning their funding was cut, Gibson learned they could reapply for the grant, but with an overtly patriotic twist.
We learned that there was a new American History and Civics grant competition honoring the sesquicentennial.
The word semi-quincentennial in this context refers to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which will take place next year. Belsha describes the Trump administration's reasoning for focusing on 1776.
The goal of, I think, the celebration at the federal level is to kind of think about the founding principles and how we've lived up to them or not. And I think there's kind of different thinking about the ways in which we haven't lived up to them. I think that this is kind of a moment that some people want to talk about that and have debates about that. But I think the Trump administration generally describes it as a time of celebration and that we want to recognize how far we've come and what a great country we are.
Gibson says that desire for celebration is evident in the language of the new grant application.
The wording is completely different. The call for proposals is completely different. In the former version of it, all of those preferences were focused on improving educational outcomes for underserved students, particularly around innovative and evidence-based practices in civics and history education. It still says that part, the innovative and evidence-based practices in civics and history education, but the focus is now on that commemorate the American sesquicentennial and the founding principles and founding documents of the American tradition. And it lists specifically Constitution, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence.
Using the word commemorate is interesting. On its face, the word may evoke a desire to simply celebrate the country's foundational documents. But for Robert Smith, history professor at Marquette University and director of the department that manages MKE Roots, this program embodies the founding principles by giving today's students, especially today's students of color, reason to see themselves as part of American history.
The more voices we include, the better we get at it. The more narratives that get included, the more ideas that get included, the more locations we might include in which we can see that spirit of civic engagement and democracy come alive. The more murals we get to go see, you know what I mean? The more community spaces we get to visit where we see democracy in action. Like, that's what we're doing. And it is very challenging to come up with the words to explain this process, but it is indeed this renegotiation of civil rights and the language of civil rights to suggest that a very narrow community is being injured, when actually what we should be doing continually is opening up those pathways as broad as possible to get to more meaningful definitions of democracy.
MKE Roots has reapplied for funding under the new guidelines. However, Gibson notes that the Trump administration seems to already have plans for where the money will go.
In terms of preference priorities, there were all sorts of preference priorities in the past focused on specific subgroups of students and their civic engagement and their academic achievement. The only competitive preference right now is that your university has an independent center of civic thought that emphasizes these principles, these founding principles.
An independent center for civic thought is a relatively new phenomenon on college campuses. They tend to take politically conservative perspectives on American history and bring primarily conservative speakers to college campuses. These centers include the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's School of Civic Life and Leadership, and Arizona State University's School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Belsha explains the rise of these centers and their ties to the Republican Party.
the foundation of these different civic centers was in response to what conservative scholars saw as a lot of colleges being overly liberal and not having a robust faculty in kind of history and civics education, and wanting to draw more attention to those areas and having folks who had a lot of kind of constitutional understanding and scholarship under their belts. So the kind of criticism of that is that a lot of times the points of view that are represented at the civic centers aren't that diverse, and that it's just a lot of folks who, have kind of the similar conservative bent. Also, there's been a lot of these centers that have gotten funding through Republican-controlled legislatures, so they're kind of seen as partisan, and maybe not something that the university wanted to start, but that they were kind of pushed to start.
The cards may be stacked against MKE Roots. They are not connected to a Republican-funded civic center. Their work has previously been labeled DEI by an administration who is hostile to the phrase. The goals of the new grant seem to be focused on celebrating the Founding Fathers, prioritizing the memorization of facts over critical discourse. But for Smith, the historical time period we focus on is of secondary importance. Innovative educators will find a way to develop tomorrow's critical thinkers, whether we're discussing Milwaukee in 1967 or Philadelphia in 1776.
We can do this however it needs to be done. And so if we want to go back to 1776, I can't wait to be in a classroom and have students read the Declaration of Independence and tell me what they think about it today. Cannot wait.
As for Sepia Grace Buchanan, the 7th and 8th grade teacher and MKE Roots alum we met at the beginning of this piece, she's seen the power of teaching local and relevant history. And it's going to be tough to put that power back in its bottle.
Within my classroom is so much diversity, and I tell them we all have a right to be loved and respected in this classroom. And everybody just needs to feel that they belong, and I feel like this particular project does that. It definitely does that, especially for this age range when some of them are kind of lost or don't know who they are. This does that for them.
That piece was produced by Lake Effect's Sam Woods.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.
It's rare to find a podcast that can actually change your life. But when the show's called Life Kit, that's kind of the whole point. I'm Mariel Segarra. 3 times a week on the Life Kit podcast, we guide you through a topic we could all use help with, from personal development to healthy living to managing your dinero, with takeaways so you can start living what you learn right away. Escucha el Life Kit podcast from NPR.